So I want to continue with this series that we've been doing. For those who haven't been watching, we've been talking about distorted thinking. So these are sort of cognitive errors that happen in our reasoning, especially around topics involving our friends, our family, or simply us, or the world as a whole. And I think, obviously, any of these we could go off on a much longer tangent. We could have very, very long conversations about them. But the reality of the situation is that we want to try to get through these succinctly so that we can kind of have an overview, and we can always come back to them if need be. So what I want to talk about is something that I see a lot in the online sphere. And I think I'm going to use a little bit different terminology than it uses here, though I'm going to use the term that's used here as well. So let's take a look at our 15 styles of distorted thinking. Last time we covered catastrophizing. You can see that video is up right now. You also can see control fallacies. That video is up right now. We might do another one discussing external control fallacies. Okay, Tova. We will get to drama when we can, but let's get through this first. Polarized thinking is the one we're covering now. And the reason why I think this is so important is, there we go, now it's readable. So the reason why I think this is really important is that I see this as sort of a toxin that affects most people. It's described here in this little infograph as things are black and white, black or white, good or bad. You have to be perfect or you're a failure. There is no middle ground. So in working with clients, what I see this as is a lot of times kids who have authoritarian parents or kids who have had an incredibly high level of sort of a high level of standard put upon them. What they do is they sort of hold them to a standard that's unreachable. And then what goes on is they try to reach for that, inevitably failing at some point, even if they can temporarily do it because it's unsustainable. And then they beat the shit out of themselves for it. Because what they've done is they've established a binary. You're either good or you're bad. You're either a success or you're a failure. And so the problem with this is that it affects things on two levels. So there's first the very personal level, which is if I look at my actions and I look at the way things are in the world and I see how I behave, my actions can be summed up as a wholly essentialized notion of good or bad. And you can see this in some ways people interact with things or how they do. If they fail, they suddenly act as though this is an existential crisis, most likely because they've essentialized themselves. They've said, as long as I'm succeeding, I am okay, good, right? There's a way in which our self-esteem, our self-story is improved by those successes because we as human beings seem to really enjoy success. We seem to get a lot out of it. There's something really enjoyable about completion of things and doing well in them. And rightfully so, but when we become so fixated on those outcomes, what happens is that it can start to create this image of black and white thinking. And on the personal level, where this can be really harmful is, so let's talk about this in two different ways. So one of them could be is by looking at yourself as either absolutely horrible or absolutely wonderful. And if the prerequisites, that is the causal factors that are in some way connecting to why you feel either which way, are based on very arbitrary things such as people's temporary opinions of you, their own polarized thinking in the form of sort of a projection, anything like that. The problem being is that you become so, your locus of control becomes so externalized that in many ways, all it takes is a gust of wind, so to speak, to suddenly put you in a position where you suddenly feel awful, right? Because all of a sudden, all it takes is one little setback or failure or whatnot to make you question your whole sense of self or to just look at yourself as terrible. So that's the first way this can be harmful. And the way we deal with this in therapy is, in a lot of ways, what I like to point out is the nuance. I like to point out complexity. I think there's a lot of tendencies for people to sort of simplify things. This kind of just is part of the human mechanism. We're really good at meaning making. And one of the things that really sucks about that is that because of the way we do meaning, the way we do meaning making is we like to do bite-sized kind of ideas, bite-sized notions of sort of things. And it has a tendency to cause problems like essentializing. It basically melts a thing down to say, this is all of this, right? And that can be really hard because if you yourself are somebody who has done something not great, but is learning, from an essentialized view, you're just awful because that's something that's inherently part of you. That's something that is intertwined with you. Yeah, kind of. I mean, what I would say is that there's in that process, yeah, like I could see that being a definite thing because like in a lot of ways, I think oversimplification is a part of this. I think it's a way in which we sort of look at ourselves and essentialize ourselves down to these very clear success, failure, black, white perspectives. And the thing is that I think this comes from the fact that the way the cognitive apparatus in our mind works is that we like to sort of take things and make sort of like a heuristic around them, a rule or an idea around them, because complex stuff is a little hard. You have to hold things. You have to hold sometimes cognitive dissonance because a thing may be somewhat inconsistent, or it may have direct paradoxes in it, or it could be any number of things. And so in a lot of ways, what we get into is, I think it's really useful in therapy to start pointing out how complex things are, right? Instead of getting stuck in this oversimplification. It's one of the reasons I get really frustrated with discussions online too, because in a lot of cases, online spaces, Twitter most notably, feed into this shit. And I'll get to that in a little bit. But on the personal level, what it does is I actually think this can be harmful in two ways. It can either be harmful because you may look at yourself in a fairly negative view with very little change happening around you, or you may look at other people as essentialized. And I think social media feeds into that, right? So think about it like this. If you're online, let's say on Facebook, and you see a person posting about something, maybe let's say it's conservative nonsense, there's a tendency to see that and immediately assume this person's the worst in the world. And I would argue that while I absolutely think that this person's probably believes in some fairly abhorrent things, I don't want to necessarily essentialize this person as just bad. That doesn't mean I have to be around them. That doesn't mean I have to like them. But this idea of this oversimplification, this polarized thinking that they are all of this, can be really problematic. One of the most notable ones is that when we see somebody behave in a particular way in our life, be it our family, our friends, or whoever, we may try to boil them down to this very simple notion. Now, how does this relate to the larger discussion? My argument would be is that within therapy, the way we deal with this is by adding complexity and realizing that people are more complex than just simple essentials. They're not just boiled down to simple notions or simple ideas. They are often very complex. They are often contradictory. They are often out of integrity, right? That means that their actions and their words don't match up in a lot of cases because I think people are inherently hypocritical. In fact, I think integrity is actually the lesson throughout life, learning how to not be out of integrity. It's a way for your actions and your words to match up. And I don't ever think there's a way in which that's ever going to be finished. I actually think that's an ongoing, lifelong task. And so I think when I work with clients around this, one of the things I'll notice is that they think, well, I can't do this because that thing is really easy and I can't do it. So what the fuck's wrong with me? To which my response is, how is it easy? So I don't go after the simplified thought first. What I do is I go after the presupposition. How does that work? You're making an assumption that this should be easy. But if you're dealing with depression, anxiety, ADHD, or any number of things, by definition, it's not going to be easy. If you're neurodiverse, if you're somebody who's dealing with depression, you're just, it may not be easy. And as such, that changes things because the presupposition is based off of negative thinking. It's based after our negative view of ourselves. Right? Like Sundrop Center, you mentioned there, I sometimes feel aggravated that I haven't nabbed a job in my area of expertise immediately after graduating college. But again, we're in the middle of a recession. Everybody's trying to hold on to jobs as much as they can. Not to mention companies are trying to be very, very frugal about how they hire because, again, they're also taking hits because of COVID. Not saying that's right or wrong. That's just kind of what I understand to be happening. And so the thing is there are factors that literally have nothing to do with you that may be preventing that. But in a lot of cases, when people hear something like, hey, maybe we need to take into consideration these overarching factors, those don't always feel satisfying. It's actually much simpler to kind of go, well, it must be something wrong with me. Maybe I need to fix my resume. Maybe I'm just not a good candidate. Maybe this whole thing was worthless. Maybe that $50,000 that I have in student loans was just a terrible idea, and I could have just instead tried to find gold on the beach. I don't know. So that's kind of where I'm thinking on this one, is that this idea of black or white, it always has this moralizing feel. There's a way in which we sort of take a thing, and instead of looking at it in the framework that it kind of better sits, we turn it into a moralizing thing. So with somebody who thinks very negative of themselves, very awfully about themselves, what they might do is go how do I say this? So they may say in a situation that, I'm terrible, I'm this, I'm that, but they actively ignore data points to come to that conclusion. There must be something wrong with me if so-and-so worries about me or whatnot. But the truth is that's not always the case. There may be actually that maybe your loved ones, your family, your friends just care about you and they want to be there for you. Maybe they legitimately want to be there and no one's looking down at you for being in a position right now that sucks. There's a way that mental illness can become its own form of self-blame, and it becomes really problematic. And so one of the things I invite you all to do is, when you're having these types of thoughts, when something feels just absolutely awful or absolutely good, and I don't just mean about yourself, those ones are hard, but I would even mean in your day-to-day, I would try to be more complex about that. Now, do I think we're going to be able to work on it all together? Yes and no. I think in situations that appear to be discussions of good faith, or in safe spaces in which people's mental health is really important to manage, I think that it is really important to come from a place of curiosity and not jump to some sort of polarized thinking. And I would argue that also in certain situations, no, polarized thinking is actually a survival strategy. Full stop. It's just a survival strategy. And the reason I say that is that when you're dealing with conservatives or fascists or Nazis, what you're going to see in those circumstances is that they may appear as though they're trying to have a good faith engagement or conversation with you. But remember, in a lot of cases, their premise always starts from the place of, it would be better if you didn't exist. If you're a marginalized person, whether you're a person of color, you're trans, gay, bi, indigenous person, any other person of color, whatever, the messaging is really clear. They just don't want you around. And they can try to show up with smiles and engagement, but the fact is that you do not owe them shit. And so in that regard, I actually think polarized thinking can be a very useful way to sort of cut through this idea of respectability. This idea that you're supposed to treat people who are your political enemy as someone safe or someone who's engaging with you in good faith. And not to say that there aren't conservatives you could engage with in good faith. I haven't met any, but I'm sure there's some out there. But in regard to people who are actively and outwardly fascists and shit like that, no, I think that there's a real way in which no, you don't owe them pushing through this distortion. Because I don't know if it's a distortion at that point. I would actually argue that it doesn't fall into that criteria anymore. It's actually sort of looking at data points in the situation and coming to a conclusion that has the highest probability of you surviving or getting out of that situation without being emotionally harmed or damaged, right? So I'm not saying you have to get rid of this in every particular thing. I actually think some types of polarized thinking are okay. In children's shows, for example, the good guys are good, the bad guys are bad, and nothing else. There's something very simplistic and nice about that. But the problem being is that humans just don't work that way. And I know we understand that cognitively on a rational sort of conscious way, but that doesn't necessarily seem the same when we talk about very obvious situations of simplicity. The only respectable conservative I've ever read is Buckley. He voted for Obama. Yeah, Marty, that's fair. Though I'll argue that from what I understand from people who are way smarter than me, Obama was fairly right-leaning on his economics. He was sort of sold as this progressive, but in a lot of ways, he's more right-leaning than Reagan. So, that might just be parroting things. I might have to look into it. But Yeah, it's hard because like what we call progressive Democrats, and Obama sadly falls into this, in many cases are just very much moderates, and it sucks because like there are very real good things these people did, but there's also ways in which they did really awful shit. Obama, for example, continued drone strikes, and that was a thing. So yeah, I mean, like, respectable conservative always comes with like a asterisk in my mind. But so with all that said, and kind of the ways to challenge that and think about that, I especially think mindfulness is really useful to this. Mindfulness meditation can be incredibly helpful, and I'll probably say that about a lot of these, but this one specifically because I think it's really useful to step back and realize that you're not really thinking about this in a complex or meaningful way. It's very easy to essentialize, and it's very easy to get outraged by that essentialization. So, how does this relate to the drama I'll be talking about later? Because I think that we do this to other people too. And I think we do this as groups. So recently, for everyone who's aware, there's been some very real drama with Lindsay Ellis being sort of harassed to the point where she felt like she needed to delete her Twitter. And then she came back with a video that was pretty fucking scathing. And we'll be talking about that a little bit later. But what I notice is if you go through Twitter and you click on, the Lindsay Ellis trending, what you'll see is nothing in the middle. You'll see, I found one comment that we had gotten on a video saying, like, I didn't necessarily like how she said that, but I also get that, like, this isn't necessarily that deep. Like, it was somebody kind of, like, rationally going, okay, well, like, I think she could have said it better, but I don't think she deserved any of the stuff that happened. That was one comment, to my memory. Everything else was very polarized thinking. It was either, let's shame all the woke scolds for flipping out and attacking this person, because, Lindsay Ellis has not only showed up talking about them trying to cancel her, but also with every other time she's been attemptedly canceled and like kind of pushing back. And a lot of people felt vindicated by that. And on the other side, you have people who are, the internet has affectionately referred to as woke scolds, or derogatorily, I guess. And these folks lash out. They just keep going with the same narratives over and over again. This person's terrible. This person's terrible. This person's terrible. And it's still essentializing. I can basically say that every single time, anytime a left-leaning creator's been harassed, attacked, canceled, whatever term you want to use, I would argue that there's often a lot of essentialization going on. There's a tendency to think in polarized way. This person is all bad. Like, one thing that was brought up in Lindsay's video that I thought was really impressive is that she brought up her own sexuality, how her as a bisexual woman didn't feel welcomed to Pride really, and didn't feel like she was really welcome there. She was somebody who felt like she was sort of imposter syndroming. She felt like she wasn't supposed to be there, or that she wasn't really prideful about how she was, because it was a very complex thing in her head, which is fair. And because of that, that might have led to some fairly not great interactions with a friend of hers. But again, most queer people do something shitty once in a while because we're all still learning, and sometimes we interact with things really not great. Look at all the trans girls who are, maybe former misogynists, for fuck's sakes. Excuse me. So this type of polarized thinking, this way that we sort of engage with people online, I think is really problematic. Because in some ways what it does is it circumvents the attempt to feel shitty about ourselves, and instead we feel outraged, vindicated, and justified for our negative critique towards the other. Right? There's another thing that Lindsay brought up in her video where she talked about the idea that she is, how did she say that? Like, I don't remember offhand now. My brain just died. Sorry, get back to this. So like with this type of polarized thinking, I think there's a very real way in which we often want to just see people as these dyed-in-the-wool, awful people, or racists, or, transphobes or whatnot. And I'm not saying those titles can't be true for some people. I do think there is such a thing as a moral event horizon. Obviously, the lawmakers who wrote the Florida law that allows for fucking genital inspections on children, by definition, that shit's fucked. You've lost the plot. But I think we need to figure out where that line is, because I think there's a lot of people who want to lash out and say, this is the line, you've crossed it and there's no coming back. And I'm very hesitant to do that in some cases, because in a lot of ways, I think we damage people who could be genuinely useful to kind of spreading either liberal or leftist notions. And I would actually go so much further and say that, like, in a lot of ways, this idea of purity testing everyone doesn't actually align with leftist values. So one of the things I talk about a lot on Twitter, or I'll make mention about, is my belief in rehabilitation. I believe that we should completely, from a utilitarian perspective, reframe our entire way of looking at imprisonment and looking at rehabilitation, look at these things. And that's really hard to do, because if you've ever watched Contra's video on justice, she talks about this. People love retributive justice. They love the feeling of justice being served, even if it's just eye for an eye, right? Even if the state's doing it. This is why all these people get hard-ons when they see the cops, you know, take down somebody. There's a reason why so many Reddits have on them this idea of, like, justice served, because people enjoy that essentialized thinking and this way in which they think that justice being done, because retributive justice feels good. It feels powerful. Rehabilitation does not. And rehabilitation comes with the added addition of complexity. It doesn't feel satisfactory from a very primal emotional state. Like, that's just kind of how that works. And I would argue that when we start to essentialize the people in front of us, unnecessarily or too quickly, I think we create a scenario where it's very easy to start marginalizing and attacking them directly. And some of those people, I would argue, don't deserve that. Marty said in the chat, it sometimes seems like woke scolds set want to... The woke scold set want to limit valid queerness to non-passing LGBT plus people, another essentialization. Yeah, I haven't seen that specifically, Marty, but I would say, like, there is a way in which I would say that there's something going on here where if you're a person who agrees with them, you're one of the good ones. But if you don't agree with them, rather than using that as an opportunity to go, wait, maybe I'm in error, or hey, maybe they can explain to me and we can have a good faith conversation about why we have differing views, what they often do is essentialize and push away. What should be someone they are welcoming or supporting becomes somebody who they alienate. And the problem is there are people who are ex-Nazis, people who are ex-conservatives, people who are trying to learn, trying to get better, especially if they came from a very homophobic, transphobic home and they themselves came out. And to push those people away because they might do a microaggression or because they might do something that isn't couth, the issue with that situation is that we are just feeding our enemies at that point. We are just giving those people back, because they, now being alienated, may just go back to what they were doing, because in some ways, at least the people there accept them. Maybe not the real them, maybe not the out them, but there's something there, as opposed to the leftist purity testing where in some communities and some interactions online, there is no real way to ever be okay enough. And this happens with a lot of marginalized groups. You'll see this a lot where, what was it, in Lindsay Ellis's video, she mentioned the thing about, like, specifically how, like, looking at marginalized groups as a monolith is fucking cringe. And it absolutely is, right? Because I think in a lot of ways what ends up happening is that when we do this essentialization, when we see an opportunity, or we see an example, maybe better said, of somebody who doesn't think in that way, we either sort of discount them or we just attack them. They're, again, polarized thinking, because we have cognitive dissonance around somebody who thinks differently. Even though they're a member of that group, we get really upset. This is actually why I think the right is so good at being able to sort of use identity politics against us. The thing is that we have this belief system that we should listen to marginalized groups, and we absolutely should, full stop. And we should also look at the evidence and data, because in almost every circumstance, the evidence and data backs what we're getting reported to us through marginalized groups, because there's now an empirical reality and a subjective reality that are connecting. But the problem with identity politics, the problem with the way that the right engages in this, is that because they know people don't want to just shout down somebody who comes from a marginalized group, then they find people who are tokens and use them as a way to shut down the conversation. This includes Blair White, Calvin Guerra. This includes Candace Owens, right? These are all people who, while members of a marginalized group, tout and use conservative propaganda to do harm. Like, it's just that simple. And the thing is that they kind of fly in the face of this believe marginalized people thing, because there are individuals who are willing, for their own small piece of acceptance, are willing to throw the rest of us under the bus. And that's fucked. Like, can we be honest about that? That's fucked. So I want to be really clear about that, is like, when we're talking about these types of situations, it's never so simple. And these buzz phrases we create, like, you know, listen to marginalized people, you know, listen to the trans people in your community. These are all good ideas in principle, but what they do, hey, Hanging Wednesday, but what they do is they open us up to this kind of negativity. And I think the issue is that the reason why that right-leaning tactic of using tokens as a way to push back on this believe marginalized people narrative, one of the reasons why I think this is so harmful is that what it does is it flies in the face of this polarized thinking. If you just say everyone's good because you're thinking in black and white terms, then someone like Candace Owens, Blair White, Calvin Guerra, these people can actually really kind of confuse and make things very, very problematic. But I also think, and this is where another form of essentialization comes in, is there's a very big difference between recognizing a token who's doing demonstrable harm, such as Calvin Guerra organizing very real hate mobs against non-binary people, and Blair White attacking trans women, or Candace Owens saying the Democratic Party is the new plantation or some nonsense. Like, let's be super clear. Like, there's a big difference between those people who have literally sold out everybody else and people who are learning. There's a big difference between that and someone who is, by definition, new to the queer community, a person who is finally speaking about their experience as being a person of color, or someone who's speaking out about anti-Semitism. People, when they join new communities, especially leftist ones, are going to make mistakes. And I think we need to be able to recognize the difference between mistakes and growing pains versus essentializing people as evil or bad. Because I think we hurt ourselves on a political level, and I think we hurt ourselves on an emotional level. Because the problem is no one can live by certain standards. No one can ever get to those standards. We all engage in systems of power. We all are part of capitalism. We all were assigned ethnicities and races based on our birth. There are ways in which we're always interacting with stuff, and we can do the best possible job to try to not acknowledge this, but we're going to make mistakes. And the unwillingness to accept that and actually just give people the opportunity to learn, I think, does real harm. And it all stems from, in my opinion, polarized thinking. This thing the media has gone off on saying, oh, the politics are so polarized. They should be. Because there are very real existential differences between the current political system and how the people in it actually look at reality. Like, this isn't even just a difference of politics. It's a difference of what we see as objective reality. Especially during the Trump era, objective reality was really in question for a minute there, because conservatives were not interacting with anything that even remotely looked like that. Right? So, like, we have to really be considerate about this. I'm not familiar with what Diamond and Silk was. I want to finish that thought, but I'm not familiar what was brought up as Diamond and Silk. Sundrop Center, yeah. I've watched that video. I will admit that there is a part of that video I get a little bit irritated with, because there is a little bit of a flub as far as information by Sarah Z about Lily Orchard. But I've actually warmed up to Sarah Zed's, excuse me, I didn't mean to call her Sarah Z. Sarah Zed's content a lot more lately. I've actually really enjoyed it, because it's a lot of like sort of socialization deep dives on, like sociological deep dives on like weird fucking internet groups like Homestuck. I think that stuff's really interesting because I didn't get hit by those. I was probably a little bit too old. So it's really interesting to have like a lens as a clinician, and then also being able to see that and understand it. I do think that video does have merit though, because I do think there is a way that marginalized people are held to an incredibly high standard. For anyone that, I mean, I'll say ContraPoints is a perfect example. Like, I think that there's a way in which you can make some very real critiques towards Natalie Wynn. I don't think the stuff I see normally, you know, in most circumstances is not that kind of stuff. Trumpsters like dumpsters, you know. So does this make sense? Is everyone understanding this idea? And why I think it's a problem both at a internal personal level and why I see it as an issue from a sort of projected level as well. That this can be really harmful when we aim that lens at ourselves. And I think it can be equally harmful when we sort of when we sort of aim that lens at other people and sort of essentialize them down to very bite-sized notions of who they are. I think social media is a big part of this. Give me 1 second. I'll be back in a moment. I'm going to actually fix this sound behind me because it's loud as shit. Oh, I know what that is. That's your computer fan. Okay. That's fine. We'll deal with it. I don't think it's picking it up except when I talk, so people will just have to deal. Yeah, we'll have to clean it out. That's fine.
Well, it's not a cleanup issue. It's a
fix-it issue. So. It didn't post. My previous comment, Damon and Silk are a pair of African-American women who got famous by being conservative Trumpsters. Oh, you can't hear it? Excellent. That's great because it's loud as shit out of my end. So, no, actually, what is it? What are they called? Oh my God, I forgot the name of it. There's a choir group that's literally like, has a song literally said, "Real women vote for Trump." Good. That means new mic is working. This is what your donations go to, is not blowing up your ears. So I feel like this is kind of an issue is that, yeah, like the Diamond and Silk thing seems like a really good example. Is like, I feel like when you have the deplorable choir, bam, that one, those fucking awful people. Jesus Christ. Yeah. Oh God. Yeah. No, they are terrible. Who did I see them on? I saw them on, oh, I forgot her name now. There's a really lovely young lady who just does weird fucking internet content, and she is fantastic. I see her stuff occasionally. But she did a thing on the Deplorable Choir and talked about how fucking weird they are. She also did a video on Bang. I'll try to find her name for her at some point. But yeah, like, holy shit. Fucking Bang. But yeah, so I really just want you guys to understand this, like, at a clear level, is like, when we're talking about this idea of, like, when we're talking about this idea of essentializing, when we're talking about this notion of the way we view ourselves and others, I think this is harmful all the way around. Because I think it's the same essentialization. I think it's the same tendency to sort of think in a polarized way. No, let me see if I can find her, because otherwise I'm just gonna like bug myself for this for like the next 5 years. Hold on. Deplorable choir. Oh, Casey Aonso. It's pronounced, her last name is Aonso. Casey Onanso. She's got like an entire video about the Deplorable Choir and why they're awful. Yeah, I'll put the name in chat. Yeah, I actually really like this girl. She is super fucking, she is super fucking, like, snarky in a way that I really enjoy. So, but anyway, so yeah, I hope that makes sense. And I think we're going to cover this probably again, especially tonight, but I think we're going to probably have to cover this again, is that this idea that your and our and everyone's tendency to be this essential can lead to some really fucked up outcomes. And I think this is a problem, especially online, because I think online distorts this even further and makes it very easy for us to sort of hold people to these standards that just don't really exist. Like, I think in some cases, some of the things that we critique people on are actually a bit of a leap, right? And I'll get to more of that in a minute, but I just want you guys to understand this. So look for that in yourselves. And if you do start noticing you're doing polarized thinking, try to, in some ways, break through that cognitive bias, that kind of confirmation bias, and find ways to be able to push back on some of this thinking. If you notice you're like really wired and you're really upset and you're just really engaged and like this thing feels super awful, take a step back and ask yourself, like, do I actually know this? Do I know this to actually be true? Because I think that there's a tendency for us to sort of not question how we're coming to a conclusion, because anytime we feel outrage, it's going to, of course, feel fucking good. Outrage feels good. It's addictive. I'll double down on that take. Outrage is addictive. I've been addicted to it for years. Happened during fucking Occupy. Like, it very much is an issue of, like, it's very much an issue of that being incredibly intense to feel. It's a rush because suddenly you know you are just in the right. You feel good. By being outraged, you feel good. And I think the problem is that I think there's a very big difference between being hurt and being offended. And I think that's where some of this begins. I don't know why I posted it twice. That's weird. That was silly. You're silly, Streamlabs. Anywho, ignore that I posted that twice. Shouldn't have. But yeah. Is this all making sense to everybody? Is this tracking? If that's the case, we can move on. But I just want to make sure you guys understand. So why don't we end the segment here? If you like this video, please like, comment, and subscribe. I'm probably going to cover these again later. It's super thirsty for donos. If you do want to donate, please donate at streamlabs.com/transgirltherapist/tip. And we're going to keep going through these. I think this is really helpful. And obviously, if I see other ones in sessions and things like that, I'll probably bring them up. But yeah, I think this is really cool. And I think it's something we need to keep going through, because seeing these things in ourselves and others lets us avoid unnecessary conversations with people who weren't really going to interact with us in any kind of good faith anyway. And I think it makes it so we don't hold ourselves to unrealistic standards that often paint ourselves or other people in just incredibly essentializing and frankly kind of like objectifying ways, if I'm really honest. So again, like, comment, subscribe, hit the bell if you want notifications. You can donate to us, you can become a patron, all that stuff's down below, and I will see you in the next one.